Hey guys, I just wanted to take a minute to go over this FRQ outline with you. I went through your responses and most of you all did pretty well, but I wanted to make sure to go over it, go over some possible answers, and make sure you understand what this assignment was asking you to do. So for this assignment, I wasn't having you write the entire argument essay. Instead, I wanted you to consider both sides of the argument essay. So one thesis would have been in support of judicial activism, and one would have been in favor of judicial restraint. I wanted you to consider all the possible answers to this question, just to get you a little more familiar with the argument essay and how you can go about answering these prompts. So I'm just going to go through this with you, go through some possible answers that you could have had. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that your answers were wrong. These are just possible answers. I just want to make sure that you understand. All right, so for number one, it says read through the attached judicial argument essay prompt and then outline two possible thesis statements. So the prompt says how judges view their role as jurists can influence their decision making. Some judges believe in judicial activism while others believe in judicial restraint. So for your thesis, you're to take a position on whether federal judges should exercise judicial activism or judicial restraint. So your thesis could have been something along the lines of judges should use judicial activism because the Constitution is a living document and judges need to consider the needs of the time. Okay, so that would have been in favor of judicial activism. For judicial restraint, you could have said something along the lines of judges should use judicial restraint because they should consider the intent of the framers of the Constitution. Okay, so just two examples of how you could have worded your thesis, one being in favor of activism, one being in favor of restraint. So for number two, we'll scroll on down here. It says, the second part of the argument essay requires the use of evidence to support a claim. So from the provided list of foundational documents, outline one piece of evidence that would support judicial activism and one piece of evidence that would support judicial restraint. Make sure to include a brief statement on how or why that piece of evidence would support the claim. Okay, so for part two is where I wanted you to use those foundational documents that were listed in the prompt. So your evidence needed to come from Federalist 78, Federalist 51, or the 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution. So these are just some options of how you could have used this evidence in favor of judicial restraint or in favor of judicial activism. So Federalist 78 would have been good as far as supporting an argument in favor of judicial activism, because Federalist 78 is going to support a federal judiciary that can challenge laws. Okay, so they can challenge the laws of other branches and executive actions of the president. So that would support judicial activism, so creating any kind of bold new policy by overturning existing laws. Federalist 51 is going to call for a separation of powers between the branches of government. So again, this would be good for supporting judicial activism because judges are actively checking the other two branches. And then the last one is the 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution. And we know that the 10th Amendment reserves powers to the states, okay, so those not specifically listed in the Constitution to the federal government, those are reserved for the states. So this is going to be in favor of judicial restraint because using judicial activism would strip state authority to represent its citizens. So state authority to make laws that are representative of the citizens in that state. Okay, so those are just some examples of how you could have used each piece of evidence to either support judicial activism or support judicial restraint. So the next part of the outline was just two other pieces of evidence, so outside of those foundational documents that were provided in the prompt, that would support either of the two thesis statements that you provided in question number one. Okay, so you could have had a piece of evidence for judicial activism and a piece of evidence for judicial restraint, two for judicial activism, two for judicial restraint. Okay, so evidence should come from course concepts or other foundational documents that were covered. So make sure to include a brief statement on how or why that evidence supports the argument. So here is where I feel like you all sometimes get a little lost. You're thinking, too in-depth, okay? So you're trying to pull in other foundational documents that we haven't necessarily discussed in class, okay? So you're good when it comes to using that one piece of foundational document from the prompt, okay? But when you have to pull in other evidence, I think that's where you all sometimes get a little confused. So I want to make sure to explain how you could just talk about course concepts that would support your evidence. So for example, we talked about judicial review. We talked about Marbury v. Madison, which established judicial review. So that would be a good example of a course concept that supported judicial activism. So using judicial review to check the other branches, okay, that's an example of judicial activism and supporting a thesis in favor of judicial activism. Another good example of judicial activism, or a piece of evidence that would support judicial activism, is you could say that judges are insulated from politics, okay? So they serve a lifetime tenure. They don't have to worry about being elected, okay? So they're not just going to be making decisions based on their personal beliefs. You could say that they're really there to consider the law and what's going to be best for the entire nation. Okay, so that would be another example of a course concept that would support judicial activism. But there's other course concepts that you could use to support judicial restraint. So you could say that judges are not elected into their position. So we know that they are appointed by the president, not elected. Okay, so you could say that they don't accurately reflect the views of the people. So they should exercise judicial restraint, okay, and leave the decision making up to the other elected branches. You could also say that judges still hold their own political ideologies, okay? So we know that the president is going to pick justices or appoint justices that have similar ideologies to their own. And because judges do have their own political ideologies, they should again exercise restraint and leave it up to the other branches to make decisions that affect the nation, okay? So those are just some examples of course concepts that are pretty simple, but that would really work to support a thesis in favor of either one of those ideologies. And then the last part is an opposing viewpoint for each thesis statement. So this is where you would refute or concede to the opposition. So some would say that judicial activism is a better philosophy for justices to follow, but I do not believe that it is because, or some would say that judicial restraint is the better ideology for justices to follow, but I do not believe it is because, okay, so that's where you lay out the opposing viewpoint and then you refute it. Again, you can restate your evidence, okay, and really just explain why that opposing viewpoint is either wrong or you can concede as well. So that's just a breakdown of how you could go about answering these argument essays. If you have any questions, please let me know.